Sherry probably knows more about super than anyone in Canberra. The Minister for Superannuation for many years. He's now Senior Advisor, Securities and Fund Services at Citi. Fiona Trafford-Walker is the Managing Director of Frontier Advisors. Gary Weaven needs no introduction. He's the Chair of FAST, and Mark Fitzgibbon is the Chief Executive Officer and MD of NIB Health Insurance. An interesting perspective on this discussion. So we see the overwhelming number of people there thinking that post-retirement will be the area in which the most prominent changes will occur. Then technological development, it's interesting. Not so much for tax structure and changes in investments. All right. What I'm going to do is invite each of the panellists to talk for just 4 or 5 minutes, if they would, on that topic of what super will look like in 2030 and what changes, the growth in the sector, where the industry will be investing and so forth. And then we'll move to a panel discussion. I'd like to involve the audience as much as possible in that. This is really our last a big discussion environment for the conference. So if you get thinking about what questions you want, text them in, or we'll take your questions, and we'll start with Nick Sherry.
Thanks. Well, good morning. I'll focus on 3 areas, but there is much more, particularly in technology, that I won't go to. Firstly, the size of the system has important implications for the future of funds. We're currently 1.5 trillion, will be 5 to 6 trillion in 2030. It's not just driven by the super guarantee. Little observed is Australia's population growth, currently 22 million. It'll be 30 million in 2030. And we have a broader set of contribution parameters than most other countries. Longevity, currently life expectancy is about 80 on average, higher for females. Longevity in 2030 will be 84 to 85 years. 12% of the population are over 65, it'll be 20% in 2030. Super's 100% of GDP, it'll be 180% of GDP in 2030, which means that most of the future growth will be overseas investment. Currently 16%. By 2030, I suspect at least half the monies you invest will be placed overseas. Australia's number 4 in the world, it will be number 2. It will overtake Japan and the UK, but watch out for India, Indonesia and China, who will catch up fast. It will be an era of mega global Australian superannuation funds. The top 50 funds in the world, at least 10 of them, will be mega global Australian funds of between $200 to $350 billion each. The system's quadrupling in size. Put to one side mergers, and there'll be many of those in the next 5 years because of My Super and the benchmarking that will result from My Super. Australian global funds will be a very significant presence around the world. Secondly, and very briefly, tax incentives and incentives in general. Logically, as you move to a higher level of compulsory contributions and the system matures over time, you logically do not need the current level and structure of tax and other incentives. Now, how that is phased down is a critical policy issue, but I'd suggest you start with transition to retirement, which cuts in at 55, which is an absolute nonsense. Super splitting, those sort of features do not exist in any other country. They are not appropriate and not necessary. Just finish on post-retirement. The current access age is 60, given longevity, and the pension age is moving from 65 to 67. It is inevitable, no matter who is in government, given the maturing of the system, that the super access age will be phased over time to converge with the pension access age. It is a nonsense in a retirement income system if you are, for very good reasons, adjusting the pension age to have a significant difference between the super age and the pension access age, given longevity. And there's one other key important and critical reason for doing that, which is unique to Australia. We means test our age pension, and if you don't converge the ages, people will arbitrage early access in order to maximise the age pension, which is not sustainable. 3 critical areas.
I'll move to Fiona next. Just a quick comment, though, Fiona, on that pension age. Is that something you agree with? Is that unarguable?
Yeah, probably. I think it's part of a bigger package of thinking about longevity risk and how long people in some occupations can work. Not everybody can work till they're 65. If you're in you're a building worker or a nurse, you can't keep going till you're 70 or 80. But I think thinking about those issues and converging those things, especially around the tax system, I think will probably be inevitable in 17 years. A lot can change. And just on that, it's with a bit of trepidation that I sit here and try to make forecasts about the next 17 years, because whenever anyone asks me to do that, I always think back 17 years and wonder how right I was about where I would have been today and what we would be doing today. But I've taken a similar approach to Nick and really just put together a bunch of ideas. Some of them are a little bit crazy, some of them less so. The first one I think is just around medical breakthroughs and what that means for people's longevity. A lot of medical breakthroughs will continue. There's a great magazine attached to Today's Age newspaper, for those of you that get that talks about a lot of these trends in 2030. So I read it with interest on the plane on the way here today because the timing was perfect. And the sort of breakthroughs that they're talking about will have significant impacts on the size of the population and the longevity of people. From a super fund perspective, those things will need to be funded. So innovative pension funds prepared to back those kind of investments in the private equity market can expect to see breakthroughs for cancer and heart disease, as well as things, like wrinkles, which might not be that valuable, but can make a lot of money from stopping people getting wrinkles. The China machine will march on. It will have stumbled a few times, I think. The thing that's really struck me in the last little while is just the pollution in Beijing, the photographs of the pollution there. And I think that, we cringe when we see that here, but that I can't see how that will get any better without quite radical change. And I think that the environmental disasters in China will be the factor X that will affect our market a lot. Innovative solutions to energy problems. I think the US is on its way to being self-sufficient. Fracking worries me. I suspect they'll find fracking in 15 years is pretty bad for the economy. So maybe it won't be as self-sufficient as they'd hope, but that causes huge geopolitical shifts as that trend comes through. The baby boomers in retirement, Nick covered this. Many of them will live a lot longer. They'll need smart products to manage their longevity risk. We have to think about those today. They'll be healthier than ever before. When they're 80, they'll act like they're 60 or 50. They'll routinely travel overseas for medical tourism. They'll spend their kids' inheritance, all those sort of things. And that changes the dynamics of the population here. The pension system, I think, will be under pressure because the ratio of workers to retirees will fall, and it will become harder and harder for the government to actually fund the pension system. I think that's something we have to think about. So encouraging people to save for themselves is critical on that basis alone. I would like to have seen the SGC ratchet to 18%. That is a bit of a dream. Everyone sort of flirts with 12 and 15, but it's really got to be a lot more than that. A lot of the clients we work with have members for whom a dignified retirement is really a hard thing for them to achieve. So getting those people in that situation is something we ought to think about as a society. A bit lightheartedly, sales of caravans will dive because there will be more financial encouragement for people to take an annuity and not a lump sum. So not as many trips around Australia in the caravan, which is something that Nick's been talking a lot about. I also agree global investments will feature much more heavily. Our market, the opportunity set here is going to get much smaller compared to the growth in the funds. So thinking about how we face ourselves to be true global investors will be important. There will be 40 Australian equity fund managers and around 40 funds. I think rationalisation of the industry will continue. APRA will be much happier with many fewer funds to regulate. What is a big fund? The numbers Nick mentioned, I think, are pretty right. A big fund will be $350 billion. A small fund will probably be $8 to $10 billion. So there's going to be quite a shift. I still think there's space for both groups of funds, but there will be, a dichotomy of size. I actually think the number of self-managed super funds will stabilise or even fall, as a lot of people will realise it's just not as much fun as they thought. It's hard to manage your own money. I suspect also, if you're 70 and in good health, you probably want to go to the beach and have holidays rather than sitting around worrying about your self-managed super funds. So as an industry, we need to make sure that we can provide a product that those people can trust and can value. I suspect there'll have been probably 4 more reviews of the system between now and then. I think that's a risk because it causes people to worry about the system and the security of the system. Why would you put money into a system if you're worried that in 2 years' time or 10 or 20 years' time someone's going to take it from you? So I worry a lot about that. No more monthly surveys of super funds. Hopefully well before 2030 they'll be gone. And finally, I would love to see every Australian school kid who finishes grade 12 graduating with a financial literacy certificate or something equivalent, so that when they start their first job and someone puts all of those papers in front of them to help choose their super, their option, that they take responsibility from that day and they make good decisions for themselves.
Terrific. We might turn now to Mark Fitzgibbon, for your comments.
Thanks, Alan, and hi, everybody. I wasn't sure today how obvious the connection would be between health insurance and super, so I put together a very brief presentation, and hopefully it's of some mild interest to you in any case. That's Chief up there, in case those of you who don't recognise him. How do I move this forward?
There are some slides for Mark, so could we just get an indication of how he might move those forward?
How about I give us a sign? Okay.
Peace, like that? That'd be good. Next.
Okay. Well, look, right across the world, both the developed and the emerging world, we're spending increasingly more on our healthcare. In fact, the latest economic analysis is we're pretty much spending the equivalent of GDP plus 2%, and that's been a trend for 50 years. And these numbers are a little bit dated now because the USA are now spending 17% of their GDP on healthcare. It's an incredible amount. Nick just mentioned, $1.5 billion in super savings. The Americans are spending $1.5 trillion. They're spending $3 trillion now on their healthcare. It's an incredible sum. And you can see the growth that's occurred in the last 45 years. That's just going to continue to accelerate. We're spending more because of increasing wealth and incomes. People think there's an ageing effect, and there is, so we are living longer. But it's mainly a wealth effect, probably explains about 70% of the growth. As societies become wealthier, they tend to spend more on their healthcare relative to other things. It has what economists call high income elasticity of demand, which is not to dismiss ageing and longevity. It is important. The cost of technology is a real issue in healthcare. It's not only driving the cost of a widget per se through the use of things like robotics and wonderful new drugs, but it's also driving utilisation. The rate of hip and knee replacements today compared to 40 years ago is enormous because technology's made it that much easier. And the rise of chronic disease. We're killing ourselves basically through our habits and lifestyles led by chronic diseases such as diabetes. But increased spending per se isn't a problem. We spend more money than we used to these days on LCD TVs, the internet and luxury cars than ever before. The real problems with healthcare is we're seeing overutilisation driven by a number of factors. Increased discretionary spending with limited price signals to manage demand. Insurance as a funding mechanisms used to suit nicely our healthcare spending because we only really spent money on healthcare where we really had to. We were very sick or we ended up in hospital because of an accident. And so insurance suits that non-discretionary catastrophic care. But what we're seeing today is this burgeoning discretionary element of our healthcare spending. It's a person who 40 years ago would only have a replacement knee because they were crippled. Today I need to have my knee replaced because I want to maintain my golf handicap at 12. So this is a real issue. Does insurance suit that level of discretionary spending? It's a form of moral hazard. To do with that is our limited capacity as consumers to make informed clinical purchase decisions. Now, if I go on Harvey Norman and somebody tries to sell me a high-definition TV, I know if I need that. But if my doctor says to me, Mark, you need 3 drug-eluting stents inserted in your ticker, well, who might argue? So there's this information asymmetry issue which is driving utilisation, which basically means the doctors are very good at selling their widgets. There's economic incentive amongst clinicians to overservice, what we call supply-induced demand. Again, an information asymmetry issue there. There's the increased spending, as I mentioned, as a consequence of poor health behaviour and chronic disease. Another moral hazard issue. You know, I'm not at all penalised by the tax system or by the health insurance system, which has this policy of community ratings. So everyone with health insurance pays the same premium, irrespective of their age or health condition or behaviour, such as smoking. That applies to the social health system we call Medicare, but also the private health system. So there's no incentive for people to behave better. And this is a keeper, and I suppose the most relevant issue for you guys here today, that just like we've found with super and pensions, we're simply running out of sufficient younger tax-paying people to subsidise the older retired people. You know, back in the 1950s, when we were building the welfare states that we have around the globe, you know, there was 30 or 40 working people for every retired person. Today there's less than 7. In another 50 years, there'll probably be a little bit more than 3. And this is a bit of a sign. Our costly attempts to cure death. About 2/3 of our lifetime healthcare costs will spend in the last 24 months of life. 2/3 of our lifetime healthcare costs will spend in the last 2 years of life. You know, it's a bit crazy, really. And, you know, I read an interesting article the other day. 80% of people would like to die at home, yet 27% do. Because we're fixated with this idea of putting them in hospital, trying to keep them alive and supposedly keep them happy. Well, go figure. If you look at Australia, we spend about $120 billion a year on our healthcare. You can see from that it's mainly the states and the Commonwealth who fund that. It's about 70% of the funding, and the rest is funded by, you know, through private means, be it insurance or out of pocket. You may be familiar with this graph. It's been around for a long time now. It's the Intergenerational report projection of Commonwealth Outlays going forward to 2040. And you can see, while we spend a lot of time, I guess you guys do, thinking about aged care and pensions, you can see easily the biggest threat to the fiscal solvency of government, both now and into the future, is the healthcare spending. You know, which goes from about, Commonwealth goes from about 50 billion today to about 250 billion by 2050. Well, it's not going to happen because, as I mentioned, you just don't have sufficient people to pay it. So something we're seeing around the world, which is really getting down now to the, I hope, the relevance of my brief presentation today, is, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that we can provide an insurance policy to pay for our healthcare is no longer relevant. Because of the discretionary nature of much of our spending, we have to think of more creative ways to create price signals for people and make them think more consciously and responsibly about their healthcare spending. So the type of models we're seeing is that you have an insurance product for the catastrophic cases, you know, the high, very expensive catastrophic case, but you create large front-end deductibles which people have to pay for. So it creates a price signal, it creates, hopefully, some discipline on spending and some discipline on appropriate behaviour. But the thinking is, and Singapore's the best example of this, is that the way people cover that gap, that front-end deductible, is through a savings scheme, which government has encouraged and provided the necessary tax incentives to do. There's also a case too for quarantining part of super or creating a super-style product specifically to cover the long-term costs which inevitably are going to occur associated with healthcare and aged care in particular. So if you look at the Productivity Commission report on aged care funding, they were promoting this idea of setting aside and quarantining an annuity form of product specifically for aged care, or even an equity release type product. They were very keen on that because a lot of older people have a lot of equity which they just can't unlock because of the complexity typically of the reverse equity financial products out there. And of course, as I mentioned, we need government incentives to save and insure. And I'll just finish on this slide because I've probably gone over time. I mentioned Singapore. You know, Singapore spend a very modest amount on their healthcare relative to most OECD countries. And you can see it has no implications at all, really, for life expectancy. It has no real, in fact, their under 5 mortality rate is better than the OECD, and their efficiency is very good. You know, they have this system where they rely heavily on medical savings accounts to provide that level of discipline and responsibility around demand. So, you know, I'm foreseeing a future where, and the Productivity Commission has touched upon this, where a component of superannuation is quarantine specifically for healthcare and aged care. That's it.
Thank you very much for that. That's a very interesting perspective on the discussion. And we come to Gary, who's been waiting patiently. Just give us a response to what do you think of that idea, the medical savings as a compulsory component of your super savings?
We advocated it many years ago as the way to go up to 15%, both in terms of people getting it politically, it would be a good idea, and in terms of the need. The point about all the expenditure on healthcare occurring in your older years anyway. So,
but you're so persuasive and it's such a good
natural.
idea, why didn't it win? Why didn't it get up?
The old politicians are responsible for that. Can't answer. So, look, I think that the previous speakers have made, you know, a lot of really good points. So I don't need to go over them. I thought what I might do, though, is just give three quick news items, what will be the headlines of 2030 in super news. The first one would be that Mavis Robertson misses her first CMSF conference. The second one is that Weaven, at the age of 81, finally retires and publishes several volumes of poetry on Bitter, which is a social media outlet for grumpy old men, which by then, by the way, are in plague proportions. And thirdly, that the world's biggest pension fund is created when AMP and Australian Super merge.
Right.
Beyond the grounds that no one could tell the difference anymore. I'm really digging a hole here, guys. And the big problem, of course, is that 20,000 job losses are expected as a result of synergies. Now I've really dug a hole. This is my biggest shareholder and client. There you go. Look, I had a slightly different number from Nick. Let's not quibble over the odd $500 billion. The point I would make just about that is that if we change the average cost of doing business and returns by 1%, so we got fees down by 0.25% on average over the period, other costs down by 0.25%, tax or other costs down by 0.25%, and net investment earnings up by 0.5%, so 1% difference, it makes about $1 trillion difference to the pie. So it is something which is crucially in the national interest to try and keep in focus. And the net earnings per year at that point are going to be somewhere north of 400 billion per year. So it will completely it will completely transform Australia's standing as a financial place in the world. I think that's the key thing. Just very quickly on the competitive landscape, it may well, you can paint many pictures, of course. My probably favourite would be, apart from the complete disappearance of corporate funds, which are already down to about 6%, probably the shares may not change that much, the market shares between the sectors, because while hopefully an end to commissions and best interest tests and so on will put some headwinds in the way of retail funds and SMSFs, I think the retail funds answer will be a much closer coming together of the banking and retail fund marketing. They'll do that a lot better and smarter, and that will mean that they will be assured of their place in the world, I think. And SMSFs, I think, in spite of the headwinds and Fee's point, which I give some recognition to, but I do think there's an underlying retailisation going on in super, which I think in any case will continue, even without all the charlatans selling, mis-selling. So I think that will continue. The reason it won't necessarily dramatically affect market shares, I think, is because big industry funds and some retail funds will actually provide investment services to that sector, so you'll double count the shares a bit. You know, the money will come back in part. Finally, I'll probably just say something about the investment management landscape. I think the offshore component, Nick, might be quite a lot higher than 50. I think it might be 80, up to 80 by then, percent, just because of sheer weight of money. And I think the obvious implications of some of that is that a lot bigger proportion, I think, is likely to be either in carbon abatement or in disaster adaptation strategies, or both. I think that's very likely. I think that banking and super, as I've said, I think will come closer together in a lot of ways. For example, super funds may well securitise or purchase bank debt portfolios. I think that the super funds will have to find ways to make asset classes out of a lot more economic activity. A lot more economic activity will be formed into asset classes, such as residential property, international property, much more than we have so far, corporate debt, infrastructure debt, agriculture, protein as a commodity, a big theme potentially, and much more in large-scale private equity. A lot more, I think, in large-scale private equity in Australia and around the world. And finally, some fund managers will have to become centres of excellence for actual management of assets. The actual management of assets, not just origination of deals and trading and funds management. The actual management of assets will become a centre of excellence criteria for super funds. And the obvious thing to say finally is, you know, super can be all of that or absolutely nothing. It is totally a creature of legislation and regulation. And, you know, it depends, therefore, on the political landscape. It depends. Politicians can never be any better than the media. So it depends on the media. If we're going to fulfil the high road, then we're going to need to focus on long-term investing and carbon abatement.
Very interesting. We're having a couple of questions come in via the text service. They're good, they're quite specific. Any big questions that you want to have put, just bring those in now if you would, because we have about 12 minutes remaining for questions. Look, I just sort of want to start with a bit of a big picture question, and that is, you know, the complaints about, and you've touched on it there, Gary, tinkering with the system. Comes back to the fundamental question of, as the system matures, you get to this kind of existential question of what do we want the system to do? What is it here to do? The Australia Institute put out some research saying that the tax concessions around super are greater than the savings to the government-supplied pension. And so, therefore, at what point do you draw that line? You've started to touch on that, Nick. Do you want to take that for me? What should the industry hold itself to? Modest retirements, comfortable retirements?
Well, the objective of super, a compulsory super, has been to add on to what is a modest government DB pension, extra retirement income for low middle income Australians. That's the objective of super.
An add-on.
It's an add-on because the means test doesn't remove low and middle income earners in the main, 60%. From the age pension, nor should it, in my view. You have lots of different arguments about self-funding. I mean, the logic of a higher income earner receiving an incentive or a subsidy via the tax system that is in excess of the value of the age pension, that's just not a logical approach. So there's always going to be a government constraint on the level of incentive or subsidy, depending on your perspective, for higher income earners, and there should be, in my view. There are very good policy reasons for that. But just let me conclude with the comment, having been a former politician and observing the debate with interest at the moment, get used to it. Get used to it. I think there's a degree of naivety about change. The reality for any government, and it doesn't matter whether it's Liberal or Labor, they get their budget briefs, they get their expenditure briefs. I've seen them, I've had to respond to them on occasions. When any government is challenged with a major increase in costs, in this case driven by longevity to a large degree, they are going to change the system. The federal government continues to change education policy and health policy. And the federal government of the day is going to continue to change retirement incomes policy.
All right. And can I go to Fiona? If you accept that's what the system was always designed to do and they're the pressures on the system, then thinking about what Nick was saying earlier about the sorts of changes in the taxation structure, how do you see those changes? Do you agree with it?
Well, I have My preference would be that retirement incomes policy was sort of outside of the political football field. I think the thing that worries me, and I'm sure the trustees around the table would hear it from their members, is there's just too much change. There's always a review, there's always someone reviewing the tax system, there's always cuts in caps, things like that. There's a question earlier on the lower on that board about how do you look after women because they have broken work patterns, and how do you support them getting the sort of gender equality in their retirement balances. So for me, I'm not really a tax person per se, but it just seems to me that government exists because we put them there. Well, some of us put them there and some of us choose the next one next time, but they exist for us, to do things for us. And I think a lot of the stuff going on at the moment is really for them. And so I think that us as an industry, we can sit back and we should argue hard that a lot of these things that cause a lot of individuals concern about their own futures and the dignity with which they can retire ought to be outside that part of the process, if you like. But then, I accept that clearly they've got a budget to run and all those sorts of things, but it just seems to me that there's too much interference at the moment, which is going to create issues of trust and lack of trust in particular. What actually happens, I'm not really sure.
Gary, do you want to take that one?
No, I think that's had enough of that one.
Righto, let's just take a couple of questions from the board before we move on. Will we see greater social investment such as affordable housing?
I'll just add a quick comment on that. Gary will have a comment for sure as well. The issue for the funds is about returns. I mean, we've had a number of looks at, affordable housing and resi and that sort of thing, and it's just very hard to make the returns stack up compared to someone who can go out and negatively gear as an individual. So the funds ought to be open to looking at anything as long as the returns stack up for the risk that you're taking. But that's a general comment.
Yeah, so I think that's right. It's never quite got there. This current government's national rental affordable scheme is very, very close to making it actually investable. It has worked at some level, but not for an institutional level. I think there are other ways, though. These buzzwords like affordable housing, what does it really mean, Like affordable housing. It's an income distribution problem we've got. There are a lot of people in society that don't have enough income. That's the actual problem, about housing. But there's other ways to address this. I mean, some of the candidates, I think, for us to look at in part of this theme about getting closer to the banking and merging would be issue like shared equity schemes, which could solve this thing about about agglomerating funds but still having individual responsibility and so on. Shared equity, reverse mortgages, the super funds could actually, through vehicles, actually provide a lot of funding for that, as well as securitisation for the banking part of it. And, if people really want to boost low-cost housing, then they'll just need to go a little bit further with the incentives, and then the funds will pile in.
Can I ask you, Nick, and maybe Mark, you want to weigh in on this one as well? The point about the caravans and whether or not some of us younger folks may not be stuck behind caravans for the rest of our natural lives because there might be a limitation on lump sums. Is that inevitable?
Oh, it is inevitable. I just think it's a matter of the design of an annuity system, what the parameters are. I support some level of lump sum access, and I think it is perfectly reasonable for a person with a modest lump sum to go on a tour of Australia in their caravan. And it's perfectly reasonable for them to buy a new fridge and a new car, in a sense, to make a capital investment for their retirement. Well, that's perfectly reasonable to me. But I think as lump sums grow, and we've got the power of 9 and 12% contributions over time, and let's not forget at the moment the system is not a mature system, then inevitably there'll be a set of parameters. Perhaps it may be we've got a contributions minimum drawdown at the moment. Perhaps you'll have a contributions maximum with a certain level of exemption for some lump sum. I think, as I say, I think that's inevitable. I think it's important, and it doesn't matter who's in government, that we get on and design those parameters, set them in place, phase them in over time, because they'll have to be phased in over time. It's significant change, but I think that the sooner we do it and the sooner we've got the time phase in and you've got some predictability and certainty, the better off we'll be.
And Mark, what about, we were speaking earlier about this, the idea that, you know, you've presented it for us, the cost of healthcare going forward. But hey, I might die perfectly healthy at the age of 99 of a heart attack, having not been to the doctor in 20 years.
Yeah, so the economic argument is that it's allocatively inefficient and maybe inequitable to force people to retain their savings after they retire, particularly if they pass away early in life. But I suppose, and I agree with the idea of annuitisation, if the objective of super is to make sure that people are able to provide for the length of their retirement, well, I suppose you have a social contract with government that you accept that arrangement, and in return government provides you, with support for that through the tax system. So I think annuitisation is probably, that's where we'll end up. But we shouldn't dismiss the argument for a moment that, you know, it's unfair and may even lead to allocative inefficiencies. Like, really, are most people going to spend all their retirement on holiday? And because the other issue here is moral hazard, because they're thinking, oh, well, let's just spend all the money, then we go on the pension. So, you know, there's another dimension to it that needs to be addressed.
All right, we have a final question to ask of the audience before we wrap up. How many funds with over $2 billion do you think will be around in 2030? What do you think the answer to that is, Gary?
How many funds? Well, I think it will be, well, however funds there are, will be over $2 billion. So what is hard to predict is the rate of mergers. I think that there will be some, what we'll call small funds, which will be well over that, but I think there will be quite a few still left on the basis of some particular excellence about them. Over two, but still small. On the grounds that they'll have some excellence about them, because while the economies of scale are enormous in investment, in administration and in insurance, there are some diseconomies. You know? So I think some smaller funds that have focus on excellence will survive.
And just a final question, there we have the results to those. You can look at those on the board. Nick, you want to round us out here. Let's just not conclude without talking about self-managed super funds. Do you buy Fiona's idea that eventually folks want to go to the beach and this sort of enthusiasm for self-managed super funds will wane? Just briefly.
Well, I've spent a lot of time. I've got some interesting analysis about SMSFs, their cost, etc. I think the growth will be contained because I think accountants will, for the first time, be held accountable for the effective recommendation they give to lower balance super members. Under $200,000 is not cost effective in an SMSF, but it's driven by this do-it-yourself culture, disillusionment with large-scale institutions, in part because of the global financial crisis, and this belief, falsely in my view, you can do something better by yourself. But there's no scale. The other interesting issue and the other interesting response, and I think every APRA-regulated fund, whatever the space, will have a member select option in the next 5 years to counteract the leakage. You can effectively replicate, other than on property investment, and I'm working on a few ideas about how you do that at the moment, but you can effectively replicate self-managed investment through a direct engagement platform. Most APRA-regulated funds are looking at that. Some have already implemented it. And the other thing about self-managed super funds is, look, get out there and point out the disadvantages. Trio, no compensation in the event of theft and fraud. Funds should be communicating to their members, you move outside us and someone steals your money, no compensation. The average fee, if you've got $100,000 in a self-managed super fund, is 4%. The industry collectively needs to be a lot more aggressive and proactive in their communications and be proactive with members with higher balances as well, because I have no doubt this trend is not in the best interests of members. But for the reasons I've outlined, I think it will be largely contained, but what we have there is there and difficult to shift back.
All right, please thank the members of the panel very much for their contribution to that discussion.